Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us for our Evolving Alliances panel. We've been warmed up fantastically by an excellent keynote on NATO and associated issues, some great questions there. We will be continuing some of those themes, I hope. Just to set the stage very briefly, I just returned a couple of days ago from the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a gathering of Asian defense ministers, and I think it's very interesting to go from Europe, a region of formal, structured, very established alliance systems, the most enduring and successful alliance in history, to Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, a region in which you have a handful of established bilateral alliances, but overall what we see is a situation of very fluid, loose, informal, sometimes tacit defense groupings, proto-alliances, defense blocs taking shape in the region, involving middle powers like Australia, France, from outside the region, Japan, India, sometimes involving the United States, sometimes not. And I think it's interesting to reflect on what that sort of more fluid alliance environment means for us and whether there are any lessons for us in Europe. And we'll be looking at some regions, Eastern Europe, the Gulf, other parts of Europe, where we see perhaps our old assumptions about alliances eroding. We see new partnerships, sometimes within existing alliances, sometimes outside of them, taking shape. We just heard about Ukraine, Georgia. We also see groupings like EII, the European Intervention Initiative, Joint Expeditionary Force, Nordefco, all sorts of other defense groupings taking shape. And I think it's interesting if we think a little bit in this panel about what that means for how we think about alliances in Europe going forward and what that means for the armed forces in particular as well. So if we could start with Anne Applebaum. I won't read out biographies. We have them in front of us. We have them in our books. And we'll go down the panel in this direction. So Anne, would you please kick us off?
Great. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm very flattered to be speaking to such a distinguished group. I'm also very glad to be following the ambassador, who made an excellent presentation, I think, of the positive case for NATO and of Britain's role in NATO, which I was glad to hear. My remarks are going to be a little bit fuzzier and possibly a little bit gloomier, as I'm going to try and talk a little bit more broadly about the health of the alliance. I mean, I think we can all, in this room, we all know that NATO is in a very paradoxical moment. On the one hand, we are having the closest and most cooperative relationship between nations, and particularly between militaries, since the end of the Cold War. I was lucky enough last summer to go and witness for a day or two the special forces exercise that was taking place near the Baltic coast. And it was really impressive to see so many different countries working together in so many different levels. I think there were even Swedes there. There were certainly all the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, France, the US, and it was, the atmosphere was hugely positive. People were very enthusiastic about what they were doing, and people were working together in ways that we wouldn't even have thought of 10 years ago. In 2017, US tanks rolled along German roads for the first time in 15 years. American troops regularly rotate through bases in Poland and the Baltic states, and of course that British troops are there as well. American, German, Dutch, British, French troops meet regularly. They plan often. They get along very well. The problem, I think, though, that we also realize is that the real strength of NATO was always the believable security guarantee. The absolute certainty that if anything happened to anybody, the members would respond, and in particular, that the United States would respond. The irony of talking about this on D-Day is that this is the first time since before the Second World War that we have an American president who comes from the America First tradition of U.S. foreign policy. This was the most famous representative of this tradition was Charles Lindbergh, who argued very vehemently against D-Day. I pulled a quote from his famous speech that he made against joining the war in 1941. He says, gentlemen, an English victory, if it were possible at all, would necessitate years of war and invasion of the continent of Europe. I believe this would create prostration, famine, and disease in Europe and probably in America, such as the whole world has never experienced before. That is why I say that I prefer a negotiated peace to a complete victory by either side. So we now have a U.S. president who follows in that tradition, who has written a number of times that he doesn't see why the United States should be involved in wars in Europe. This was in his book that he wrote, published in 2000, so this is nothing new and nothing to do with the last election. We're also living in a moment when there are several, also really for the first time in recent memory, there are several big European political parties that have strong anti-NATO and pro-Russian beliefs and links. In the last French election, an overtly anti-American, anti-NATO presidential candidate got 40% of the vote, which was an all-time high. And it's true that she lost, but next time she might not. In Italy and Austria, political parties that openly prefer Russia to the United States are now part of ruling coalitions, or anyway, the Austrian was until last week. But although the Freedom Party, the pro-Russian party in Austria still has an amazing 19% of the vote, even now. In Poland and Hungary, two of the most successful states in the post-communist Europe, governments say they're still attached to the Atlantic Alliance, but they have been undermining their own democratic institutions, the same ones that were put in place after 1989 and that were considered the raison d'etre why they were allowed into NATO. In a number of other Central European countries, we also see doubts, and again, pro-Russian parties and pro-Russian rhetoric. When you look, those are the parties. When you look more broadly at populations, you get a kind of mixed picture. A recent survey says that only 40% of Germans and only 45% of the British say they would want their own armies to come to the aid of a NATO ally against a Russian attack. When asked specifically if the U.S. Army should fight back against a Russian invasion of the Baltic states, 54% of Americans do say that the U.S. should offer military support, which is a majority, but that still means that 4 in 10 Americans, in other words, presumably including committed Republicans as well as some Democrats, would oppose the enforcement of Article 5 in the clearest cut case. It is unsurprising then that some U.S. politicians in both parties reflect that view. And I would urge you to remember that Trump, although he is in many ways an exception and the next president may be somebody very different, he does this dislike of outside conflicts, and this isolationism does have broader support in American society, not necessarily just confined to the Republican Party. The reasons for why this has happened are quite broad. Some are beyond the scope of this conference. They're to do with feelings of powerlessness in a global world. Does NATO really help us in the ways that we need? The financial crash, which undermined Western self-confidence and certainty in the idea that the West was the leading force in the world. I think some Western, not just failures so much as refusal to intervene, the Russian invasions of Ukraine and Syria, and in some ways the failures of the Iraq War have made people question the leading role of the West in the military sphere. Don't forget that we're also living through a huge technological revolution, which is bringing about profound changes in the way that people work and how they get and absorb political information. And that's also led to a feeling of insecurity. I lived through Eastern Europe in the 1990s. I lived in Poland at that time. And one of the things I remember about it is that change, even positive change that eventually led to people living more prosperous lives, creates anger and insecurity, any kind of change. And this is what our societies are experiencing right now. I think there's also, because the one threat that people see and feel and hear about the most is that of terrorism, NATO can seem a little bit irrelevant. So why are we worried about tanks when actually what we're really worried about is terrorism in our cities? It's also fairly clear that the way in which Russia in particular has decided to oppose us is new and different in ways that our traditional alliance isn't used to thinking about. Of course, we know, I don't need to tell this audience, that Russian disinformation campaigns, as well as overt financing, are now supporting the anti-NATO and anti-EU parties in every European country, including this one, and anti-EU forces, amplifying all of those fears. And of course, it's a great mistake to view the current struggle, such as it is between Russia and the Western allies, primarily as a military competition. although we need to continue to deter Moscow militarily, the solutions to the challenges that Russia poses have to be much wider, and we may need to think about recentering the alliance on the issues that people really feel threatened by. Let me just conclude by saying, this is extremely presumptuous of me even to suggest this in this room, but as a topic for thought and discussion, even if it's not an immediate policy problem, one of the ways in which we could reinforce support for NATO in allied countries, including the United States, is to begin to think of it not just as a narrow military alliance built to fight enemies on the ground in Europe, which is what almost everybody in this room is paid to do, but also as a primary source of security for the West. And by that I mean cybersecurity, information security, even border security to some extent. Maybe NATO needs a center to keep track of Russian funding and support for extremist political parties in Europe, the US and Canada. Maybe NATO needs to be connected or at least aware of anti-corruption activities of NATO governments, because these are also part of Russian influence campaigns. More generally, the West needs to use our advantages, in economics, in information, in rule of law, our global banking system, advanced technology, commercial information technology. These are tools that we can use also to push back against Russia, both its attempts to steal information, steal commercial information here, as well as to weaken the alliance. We need to use these advantages a little bit more. It's not just going to be a military competition, it's going to be in many other fields. Maybe the US and its allies need to coordinate strategies to deny Russian access to investment resources and commercial technologies for its oil and gas industry. And of course, maybe we need to think about global strategies to fight terrorism and cyber warfare. I know some of these things are well beyond what NATO is used to thinking of itself doing, but I also know from last summer's experience that certainly the information war, the corruption war, these are beginning to be part of strategies that people use to when they carry out exercises. I'll stop there because I have limited time, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'm sort of struck by two things from that. One of them is the first theme from there was sort of political pressures on the alliance, and that's some of the issues we had discussed earlier on. The second one is I'm struck that many of the areas that you outline where alliances are called upon to do more, funding for political parties, intellectual property theft you mentioned, all sorts of other areas. These are some areas where other political organizations, other blocs may have core competencies, may have core skills, and of course the European Union is one of them. We see areas where the EU and NATO have collaborated very effectively. We also see areas where European defense integration, European defense schemes have also raised eyebrows in existing alliances, and particularly the language used around those schemes, language most prominently of a European army, but also other sorts of language, have caused some consternation or some concerns. So that brings us very nicely to a discussion of European strategic autonomy, how that feeds into some of these discussions, and I'm particularly interested in the question of to what extent this competes with and to what extent it complements and reinforces NATO and other existing alliances. And Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, and of course thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation here. It's a great honor to speak to you, and I was indeed asked to cover the subject of European strategic autonomy and also some Franco-German cooperation. And I have a sense that this probably isn't the most popular theme in this room, but I will still try to convince you, to at least make a point on why this debate is important. And I will try to do so in, a three-step presentation. I will first set out the very reason why we need to discuss European strategic autonomy. Then in the second step, have a look at the debate where it stands, and then thirdly, just briefly look at the potential for Franco-German leadership, political leadership in this context. But so first, why is this important, given that we already have an alliance, which is NATO? Well, I think that what we need to acknowledge and really understand here in Europe is that actually the degree of American implication in European security affairs is not decided in Paris or Berlin or Warsaw or London, but it is actually decided in Washington. And the backdrop of the debate on strategic autonomy is that there is growing uncertainty on the transatlantic link. Now, this growing uncertainty for me is not so much about President Trump and his tweets and so on. That is very much overrated. And it is also not about a desire of European independence or emancipation of the United States. That's a very 1990s debate that even in France has been settled with the return to the integrated command structures. But to me, it is really about profound changes in the international system and the rise of China. The rise of China's climate change, as we've just heard on the previous panel. And this is a situation in an international system that we as Europeans need to adapt to in the next, 20, maybe 30 years. And so in the debate on European strategic autonomy, it's not about black and white scenarios of a complete retreat of the United States from NATO or a European army or anything. I mean, those catchwords of a European army, that's politicians' talks. I mean, nobody, even in Paris or Berlin, seriously plans for a European army. But what is key to me is that these changes in the structure of the international system and the rise of China and many other developments that I don't have the time to expand on, they will of course have an impact on the transatlantic link and also on us Europeans. And all that is taking place at the same time that our security environment is deteriorating. And in that sense, investing in European strategic autonomy to me is actually not at all directed against NATO, but rather a contribution to this transatlantic link in two ways, if you will. The first is that it would allow us as Europeans to address security issues that are problems for us, but where the United States is not interested in taking action. For example, in Africa, which is our security environment, but not necessarily the United States. But also, given these changes in the international system, it is highly likely, at least from my perspective, that the US approach to European security will be much more instrumental in the sense that it's no longer exclusively about European security as such, as a value dear to the United States, but also that Washington will want more and more help in other theaters and in other contexts. So that is, to me, a double case in point for debating at least European strategic autonomy. Now, where do we stand in this debate? And I'd say, as you all know, the problem with this debate as it's taking place at the EU level since the notion sort of became official in the 2016 European Global Strategy is that it's never really been defined or translated into a level of ambition or anything that concrete. But what we do know is that it's somehow related to defense. And now if you look at Europe, the problem with defense is that defense actually means very different things in different parts of Europe, which of course also leads to very different ideas on what European strategic autonomy could be and where you position yourselves in terms of are you for or against it. Now, if you allow me to be a bit simplistic, you can divide Europe in basically two camps. You have one camp looking east and one camp looking south. Now, the camp looking east is obviously mainly concerned with Russia, and that's the camp that in terms of defense is mainly concerned with deterrence. And then the southern camp, it's looking south, is looking towards terrorism, things like that, and in military terms or in defense terms concerned with interventions and crisis management. And today, the first camp, the East camp, at least on paper, is the majority camp in Europe. And what's happening in the debate on European strategic autonomy is that these two camps are simply talking past each other. To me, it's not really an opposition, actually, between two visions. It's really just talking past each other. Now, why is that? And I think a key country to look at in this context is of course France, who's sort of the champion of European strategic autonomy. I mean, who invented the notion at a national level since 1994 and so on. If you look at the deterrence camp, it's important to keep in mind that we are talking conventional deterrence here, which is the one dimension that in a French debate doesn't take place, doesn't exist, doesn't happen. France talks a lot about deterrence, of course, but in a French context, deterrence is nuclear, and moreover, in a French context, nuclear deterrence is nobody else's business because it's national. But with that, the sort of deterrence part of the European defense is covered and no need to talk about. Whereas for the rest, of course, deterrence is the key activity, and it doesn't mean nuclear deterrence or maybe somewhere in the background, but it first and foremost means boots on the ground, and even more importantly, it means American boots on the ground. And if you come from that angle, of course, European strategic autonomy makes absolutely no sense, since replacing these American boots on the ground at this point, and probably even in the future, is just, illusionary, and that's the end of the story of strategic autonomy from that perspective. And I guess the unwillingness and also perhaps the inability of these both camps to actually sit down at a table and just at least define and reach common understanding of what they mean with defense is to me the main reason why the European strategic autonomy debate at this point, I would say, has almost stalled at this grand strategy level that I was talking about earlier. We do, of course, have numerous roundtables and things about European strategic autonomy, but there we are discussing things like the next round of PESCO projects or the exact features of the European Defence Fund and so on, which is all very important, and of course also the industrial dimension, which is probably the ones that Washington likes least. But this really necessary grand strategy debate on European strategic autonomy, what it should mean, what it could mean, and how to put everything together, for example, with PESCO project actually responding to lacuna in, well, when it comes to strategic enablers, for instance, for the EU, all that is not really taking place. So for this to take place, there would be a need for leadership, political leadership at the European level, and that brings me to my third point on France and Germany, on all that, in all that, and of course, European or political leadership in Europe does not necessarily have to come from France and Germany, but on the other hand, from whom else is it supposed to come? I mean, we're living on a continent when there is Franco-German leadership, everybody's complaining about the diktat of this view, but if it's not there, then everybody's complaining about the absence of leadership. And I think a second very important point also in this context is that neither France nor Germany are able to lead on their own in this context. France, for the reasons that I've just outlined, I guess France would like to play a leadership role. The problem here is that France would like to lead, but nobody really would like to follow. And on the other side, you have Germany, that I guess does have potential followers, but doesn't really want to lead, and also has a credibility problem due to its capabilities problem. So that leaves Europe in a sort of, well, place where there's not really any functioning Franco-German leadership for that. And so when it comes to the prospect for this situation to evolve, I unfortunately, I have to say that these prospects and also the past 2.5 years of debate on European strategic autonomy have shown that the prospects are rather dim. And to me, that has mainly three reasons that are, of course, interconnected. First of all, as I just tried to outline, France and Germany simply are in different camps when it comes to this East-South divide. With Germany being in the territorial defense camp, at least on paper. Now, I don't think that many people in Germany are seriously afraid of a Russian invasion, but at least since 2018. That's the official take, and that is what makes Germany have these followers, because Germany would probably be in a position to alleviate other allies' fears of ghosts in the European Strategic Autonomy debate, but chose not to do so. The second point is one that I already hinted at as well, and that is that the sense of urgency, so the vision of how necessary it really is to step up defense efforts, is completely different in France and Germany. And could say many things about that, but just look at defense budgets and the debate surrounding them as one indicator for of this point. And I think also very importantly, and that's the third point, is that they're completely different takes on the transatlantic link in France and Germany. Now, contrary perhaps to what many people might think, in both countries there's an absolute willingness to preserve that link. But the French vision is really that of these changes in the international system that I've outlined in the beginning. Whereas in Germany, the debate is very, very much focused on Donald Trump, and with the implicit idea that once Trump is out of office, things will get back to normal in the transatlantic relationship, and everything will be fine again, and there's nothing to worry about. So, just a couple of words as a conclusion. If you look at the European Strategic Autonomy debate so far, I would say it is, to a large extent, a marketing failure, a debate that didn't really work, also because the ideas were sold very badly. I mean, the very term itself, to me, is very problematic. It makes sense if you understand its, genealogy in a French context transposed to the European level, but as such, I mean, we're not talking about autonomy, and I'm not even sure we're talking about strategic things here, but I mean, in the real understanding of the world. So, but I mean, sort of a defined European level of ambition to counter to position Europe in the emerging international system. That's what we need. But so it was sold very badly, and that also made it very easy for its detractors to actually fill it with the content they want to put in there, and to then on that basis actually argue that this is all nonsense and we don't need it. And this just allowed, I think, Europeans, and allows us to continue to close our eyes in front of these challenges ahead. And I still believe that this is a very urgent debate we need to have, because we need to prepare now for what's happening in 20, 30 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So now we sort of move westward and a little further away, and if you thought the Franco-German axis was dysfunctional, wait until you hear about the GCC. David.
Exactly. Pleasure to be here. Thank you to Rusi for inviting me. I'm based at King's, and I teach up at Shrivenham, so I have the pleasure of invigilating land warfare exams next week, something I'm sure many of you will remember with an enormous amount of fondness. But as well as teaching on ICSE-L, I teach on ACSC, HCSC, and so on. Now, a key theme and a thread that I always, as my students might remember, I always harp on about is the importance of answering the question, and answering the question. And so I apologize for I'm going to answer precisely none of the questions outlined here for me. I am indeed going to speak about the Gulf monarchies, which is kind of what I do. Given this audience, let me open, of course, with my bluff, with my bottom line up front. And that is that I think there is a fundamentally new, a qualitatively new military power emerging in the Gulf region, in the wider Middle East region, and that is the UAE. I really think we need to think of this in a new way. We need to be very careful, mindful of some of the discussions yesterday. We need to be mindful about taking existing ideas and assumptions as to our allies and partners in the Gulf, and we need to update them, perhaps quite significantly. So that's my bluff, and I'll try to explain that a bit. I would like to try to illustrate what I'm on about by going through a vignette or two from the war in Yemen. My point is not really to try to give you new information, I think, but I would like to try to frame the information we all kind of know about Yemen and what went on there, but I want to frame that in a different way to get my point across. So some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Operation Golden Arrow 2015, the Emiratis in the south of Yemen. But before we get into that, just a quick word of context. So in Yemen, this is not a history lecture, fear not, but the Houthis up until 2015, the Houthis being a locally based indigenous tribal Zaidi group from the northern heartlands of Yemen, they came south, they took the capital in the center, Sana'a, and then they came south again into completely different territory, into Aden, in fact, right on the south coast of Yemen. This galvanized a reaction from Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular. And the southern half of these operations were led entirely almost by the UAE, which became Operation Golden Arrow. So, what did they do? So the Houthis, this asymmetrically trained and very experienced adversary, was ensconced in Aden. This was a classic war among the people in one of those congested, cluttered coastal cities that we heard a bit about yesterday, the fundamental and inherent difficulties of operating and weeding out adversaries from those environments. That was what Aden was. There are important caveats I should make. As I said, the Houthis were interlopers in this region. They didn't have support of the people on the ground, but nevertheless, that was the situation. So what did the UAE do, this small state of less than 1 million people? So firstly, they established new relationships around the Horn of Africa, and they built new military bases, brand new military bases for naval forces, air forces, and land forces. They then went to the Americans and said, please can we borrow, effectively, a military roll-on, roll-off ferry, because we want to move some armor from A to B. The Americans said, no, of course you can't. You can't do that. You'll probably kill yourselves. You might kill other people. It's not a good idea. Fair enough, the Emiratis said. And they went to Australia and bought one off the shelf. They just bought it. And this is the Swift. You'll have seen pictures of it in various states of repair, I'm sure. So what they did then, they inserted special forces into Aden, again, a Houthi-controlled city. They worked with local groups who were on their side, as it were. They created a safe kind of a landing zone in a relatively hostile environment. And using close air support, ISR, all that complex modern technology, from their bases around the Horn of Africa, they ultimately landed approximately half of their armored inventory of French tanks. This sort of tactical mini victory, if you will, led to the operational success, which was they pushed the Houthis with surprisingly little fuss out of Aden to liberate Aden, in effect. And they used that as their fundamental bridgehead to push further north. They also then pivoted into an entirely different kind of operation. They pivoted into a coin operation in the east. And so the scenes that we might remember in towns like Mukhalla that had Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula governing the town, showing festivals, how on TV to get money and so on, that ended. Now, of course, the longer-term success of those operations is very much up for debate, but the towns were, AQAP withdrew from the towns under that kind of Emirati pressure. And so this is unusual. As I mentioned, there are important caveats that we need to know. The Emiratis got pretty bogged down as they pushed north. As I say, they were going with the flow. The Houthis were invaders to a large degree. But we need to think of the fundamental newness of this, as it were. How many European nations could ship approximately half of their armored inventory, half of their tanks, approximately 2,000 kilometers into vaguely hostile, fairly hostile territory? That's what the Emiratis did. Important caveats to note. And I think we need to reflect on what that means. Now, It was a coalition warfare, speaking to alliances. I suppose I should use the word every now and again. They had lots of alliances and coalition members from individual tribes and different groups within Yemen. It was a multinational effort, lots of different Arab nations as well. Sudan, Senegal, it was a curious bunch of fighters all in one location. That was their kind of approach. Now, there is a certain skepticism we can and maybe should have with this, my fundamental thesis, if you see what I mean, of this small state as a new military power in the wider Middle East. The UAE is small, as I mentioned. Less than 1 million people, and their presidential guard that undertook pretty much all of the operations I'm talking about are limited in size. Also, we might remember, or we might suggest that, well, they still receive an awful lot of their training, supply, logistics from Britain and from our cousins in the States and in France. Doesn't that give us some kind of influence over what the Emiratis do? And I would caution that we need to be very careful drawing those kinds of conclusions. To a degree, those are levers of power. I will certainly write that in an article. That sounds logical to me. But in reality, how much leverage do these kinds of relations that the European and American, North American states have through those sort of logistical channels, the training channels and so on, how did that help us when it came to modifying or trying to shape Emirati operations in Libya? Not very much. What were those relationships? How could we leverage those relations when it comes to the political conflict of the Qatar blockade? Qatar being blockaded by a blockade led by Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain and Saudi. No one in NATO, no one in the P5 wants the blockade to continue. How can we use this leverage to change the Emiratis' opinion here? We absolutely can't. There is zero leverage in that particular example. And more generally, if you have operational experience with our friends in the Gulf, you might find my picture hard to reconcile with your day-to-day experience, perhaps. I've taught Gulf militaries for a very long time. I was based over there for quite a while as well. I'm not naive when it comes to the capabilities of Gulf military forces, but there is a certain reality that we need to deal with. And even if Aden was a one-off, for example, perhaps a variety of incidents came to mind to facilitate an unusual, significant operational success there. Well, given the Qatar blockade, for example, given the reach into Libya and the support of proxy actors in Libya, I would suggest that the appetite for the UAE to continue to operate in unusual ways is there. Given all of their bases in the Horn of Africa, they are a regional power, a brand new, as of a couple of years, regional power that we need to grasp with and we need to remember. And so one operation does not a campaign make, but I think it's that the fundamental injunction is to try to take in this information and, remembering some of our discussions from yesterday, try to break out of the traditional mindset of seeing the UAE and the Gulf states as fundamentally small, perhaps a bit pliable. I think those days have gone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good.